A little bit ago, I was watching a YouTube interview. Anybody watch YouTube interviews? Yeah, I spend way too much time on YouTube watching interviews and educational stuff that I say is good for me, but maybe it's not. And I was watching an interview. I was very interested in it because there was a pastor interviewing a couple of other pastors, and maybe not what you're into, but I'm kind of into. And the pastor had celebrated his 50th year in pastoral ministry. Yeah, I was like, bravo to you. I'm 10 years in. I'm like, I don't know, man, 40 more. That's a long way for me. And the interviewer was just kind of saying, hey, we got it was a pastor's conference, and we just want to ask you a bunch of questions. You hit 50 years of faithful ministry. And so they had tons of questions. The interview was going pretty decent. I was enjoying it. Until about halfway through, the interviewer asked the pastor and said, after 50 years of being a pastor, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned from mistakes you've made in your pastoral ministry? And I was like, good question, right? Like that's like, you lean in for that. You're like, all right, like I want you to have made the mistake so I don't have to make the same mistakes. Like this is a time for me to learn and grow. And the pastor sits there and he's just kind of quiet and he's thinking. I'm like, he's either overwhelmed by the amount of mistakes he's made or he's going to give like the greatest answer ever. And he's just sitting there, he's quiet. And the interviewer's like, I don't know, just like one of the lessons you've learned from the mistakes you've made? He just kind of shakes his head. And the interviewer awkwardly is like, let's move on to the next question. And I was like really bothered by that. Now, I don't know his heart. I don't know what he was wrestling through as he was thinking that. Maybe there were a few huge lessons that he learned about huge mistakes and he wasn't sure about sharing them. Maybe he went home that night and couldn't sleep because he was thinking about the 1,000 things he could have said in an interview. And yet there was something about that interview that just made me, I turned it off and I was like, God, help me know lessons that I've learned from mistakes I've made. Like, let me not be a man who's asked about mistakes I've made and I can't think of any. Like I can think of mistakes from this past week of lessons I've learned. I don't want 50 years to go by a pastoral ministry and be asked about mistakes I made, be like, I don't know, I can't really think of any. I'm sure the people in the church can think of plenty for the pastor. And yet there's something about religion, specifically religious leaders, that often creates a pride and an arrogance. This is one of the main things that non-Christians look in at the church and are just a bit grossed out by. They just have all the answers to everything. There's an arrogance, there's a smugness to it all. And I wrestle with this. Like I'm a pastor, I'm a preacher. Like I hope not a week goes by that I don't take in the reality of what's even happening in a moment like this. 180 people looking at me. I'm up here with all the answers, and I'm telling you how you should live. That better be a deeply humbling experience for me, or it's going to kill my soul. Religion has this way of an unintended consequence of us having the right answers, being spokespeople for God, where they can begin to be an arrogance that is so contrary to the heart of Jesus. And this is why story after story we see in the Gospels, Jesus' biggest issue is with religious leaders. It's with the pastors who know it all. The pastors who have the right answers, the pastors who have the Bible memorized, have it all figured out. And Jesus is constantly challenging them and saying, your certainty is going to condemn you. Because oftentimes their certainty wasn't rooted in the actual heart of God. It was rooted in their own pride and arrogance. And as today we dive into a story in John chapter 9, we're going to get a piece of this. We're going to see what I think John is talking about a danger of religious certainty. I know that might sound kind of confusing. You're like, I thought we were supposed to be certain about this stuff. There are some things we should be absolutely certain about. And yet there's a lot of other things where the certainty in our hearts causes deep arrogance and pride and even a separation from us and the living God. So if you have your Bible, run over to John chapter 9. We're going to be in really a beautiful story today. I think all these stories are pretty beautiful. But John chapter 9, if you're new with us, we've been going through the book of John. John is basically a biography of the life of Jesus. It's the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. And we're in chapter 9. And really it's just tracing the story of who Jesus is and what he has done. And so each week, while much of it builds on itself, each week there is just kind of a fresh new story, a fresh new teaching that you'll be able to dive in with. And so this story in John chapter 9, we'll start in verse 1. As he was passing by, Jesus, he was passing by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," Jesus answered. "This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. We must do the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After he said these things, he spit on the ground, made some mud from the saliva, and spread the mud on his eyes. Weird. "Go," Jesus told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. Okay, so Jesus walking with his disciples, these guys who he's training up in the way of himself. And as they're walking by, they see a man who was born blind. He's an adult man who's been born blind. He's been blind. He's a beggar. We have, by God's grace, many services that help those with disabilities today. Still makes it incredibly difficult. 2,000 years ago, there weren't services like that. Like if you were born with a disability, a blindness or deaf or whatever it was, you generally became a beggar. And so this man is begging on the side of the road, blind, and as Jesus and his disciples are walking by, Jesus' disciples ask, "Hey Jesus, who sinned? The blind man or his parents?" Jesus says, No. Neither. A couple weeks ago, we talked about a false dichotomy, remember? Where you're given two options and neither of those options are the reality. And this is exactly what the disciples walk into. They go, "This or this?" And Jesus goes, "No, neither of those things." He says specifically for this person, it was so that the works of God would be made known. So there's this certainty that we're already beginning to see in Jesus' disciples that is far from right, and yet they're certain of it. Then Jesus spits in the mud. If you want to, maybe the wildest miracle story, right? Like I've read plenty of charismatic books on healing. I've never seen the pastor go, "All right, if you see a sickness, spit in the mud, put mud on someone's face. They'll be healed." I mean, this stuff is like, what is Jesus up to? And then he does that, and then he says, "Go to the pool of Siloam, wash, and then you'll be fine." And the guy does it, and he comes back, and he can see. Let's continue. His neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit begging?" Some said, "He's the one." Others were saying, "No, but he looks like him." He kept saying, "I'm the one." So they asked him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So when I went and washed, I received my sight." "Where is he?" they asked. "I don't know," he said. So this guy comes back. He's been blind his entire life. He comes back to his town. His town knows that he's the blind beggar. Like this isn't like, "Oh, who are you?" He sits at the same place every single day begging for money. They see him now walking around, seeing. And they're like, that looks like the blind beggar. And there's division in the crew. Some are like, yeah, that's him. He can see. And then others are certain, no, trust me, that's not him. And he's like, I'm that guy. And they're like, well, then how'd this happen? And he explains. And he tells the whole story, right? If that was me, my baby would be like, hey, he just healed me. I don't need to get into the mud and the spit and all that stuff. But he says, this is how exactly it went down. They're like, then where is he? He's like, I don't know. I don't know where he's at. Verse 13, they brought the man who used to be blind to the Pharisees. These are some of the religious leaders of the day. The day that Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes was a Sabbath. Classic Jesus. Then the Pharisees asked him again how he received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, he told them. I washed and I can see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a sinful man perform such signs? And there was a division among them. Again, they asked the blind man, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? He's a prophet, he said. The Jews did not believe this about him, that he was blind and received sight, until they summoned the parents of the one who had received a sight. They asked them, is this your son, the one you say was born blind? How then does he now see? We know this is our son and that he was born blind, his parents answered. But we don't know how he now sees, and we don't know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed Jesus as the Messiah, he would be banned from the synagogue. Okay, so this story's picking up. But here's one of my favorite things about the Bible. C.S. Lewis has this phrase, chronological snobbery. It's kind of what we moderns tend to believe. Like people back in the old days were so gullible, right? Like we read miracle stories today in the Bible and we're like, we know that stuff doesn't happen. How cute people back in the old days thought that stuff happened. Read the Bible. The guy was blind, now he can see, and they're going, that's impossible. They're not like, yay, miracles, because that happens all the time. They're as convinced as you are that miracles can't happen. Even when they're seeing a man who was blind who can now see. They're like, this is impossible. And there's a division. They're going, who did this? He's like, it was Jesus, and he did it on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a day of rest. For the Jewish people, it was a day where you weren't supposed to work. And the religious leaders kept adding rule upon rule upon rule about work, what work actually meant. To the point where when someone's physically healed of blindness, they're mad at Jesus for doing work. I mean, this is the level of religious hypocrisy and arrogance. It goes, I know what God really wants. God wants not healing on the Sabbath. He wants you to just be sitting still. And so they call the healed man now, his parents, and go, tell us the story. And they back out. They're like, I don't know, we can vouch. He was born blind. He's been blind his entire life. We don't know more. And John gives us a little clue of why they are a bit afraid. Because at that time, the Jewish authorities, the religious leaders, are banning people from the synagogue if they're claiming that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the Christ, that he's the King. That'd be like in a church service if someone just showed up to Los Angeles and started claiming that they were the second coming of Christ or something. We're like, hey, if anyone agrees with that, you're not allowed here. That's what was going on because people began to pledge their allegiance to Jesus, that he was the Messiah, that he was the Christ. And the parents were going, we're not sure yet. So he's of age, talk to him. The story continues, verse 24. So a second time, they summoned the man who had been born blind and told him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Talking about Jesus. There's just this wild certainty. Give glory to God. We know Jesus is a sinner. You better agree with us. He answered, whether or not he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind and now I can see. I love that. And then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? I already told you, he said, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become his disciples too, do you? They ridiculed him. You're that man's disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but this man, we don't know where he's come from. That is an amazing thing, the man told them. You don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. You were born entirely in sin, they replied. And are you trying to teach us? Then they threw him out. So this poor dude who born blind is healed. You think this would be like a really good day for him? Like the greatest day of his entire life, where he wants to just tell everyone what's going on. And yet he's put on trial. They ask him, hey, tell us the story. He's like, I'll happily tell you the story. He tells them the story. It's like, this guy, he showed up, he put mud on my eyes, he spit, it was crazy. I washed in the pool, now I can see. And as he's talking with them, he realizes they're not as excited as he is. They're mad. He brings the parents in. The parents have the conversation. He kind of goes his own way, and then they summon him again. They want to get to the bottom of this. And he comes back. He's like, what do you want to know? They're like, tell us what happened. He's like, I already did. The story hasn't changed. They're like, who is this guy? He's a sinner. And the guy goes, I don't know if he's a sinner. All I know is this. I was blind, and now I see. There is some evangelistic gold in that sentence. I think for many of us, when you put your faith in Jesus, you've had an encounter with the living King who loved you and saved you, that the temptation is, I can't go tell other people about him until I have everything figured out. Like I have to go study all the books on apologetics and be able to defend the faith and understand the Bible and the challenging verses and all this stuff. And then once I get to that spot, then I'll begin to proclaim Christ. This guy, how much does he know about Jesus? Pretty much nothing. He doesn't even know if Jesus is a sinner or not. I mean, that's 101 stuff, right? Like if I was like, hey, did Jesus sin? Most of you are like, no. You're like, good job, right? I mean, this is basic stuff. And this guy is preaching Jesus, and they're like, he's a sinner. He's like, I don't really know, but he's really powerful. I was blind and now I see. This is what we get to do in our evangelism. Well, tell me about the verses in Jeremiah and Exodus, and they kind of contradict each other. What do you think about that? I don't know. All I know is I was blind, now I see. All I know is I was lost, but now I'm found. Jesus is the King who loves us, and he invites us into the mission of proclaiming who he is, even before we have all the answers. Who are the people in the story that have all the answers? It's the Pharisees, and they're wrong. They're certain about their answers. And yet they stand opposed to the living God. Let's continue with this end of the story. Jesus heard that they had, verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, basically thrown him out of the synagogue, like he wouldn't be allowed to worship with the Jewish people anymore because of what he had proclaimed about Christ. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, and when he found him, he asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? He asked. Jesus answered, you have seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you. I believe, Lord, he said, and he worshiped him. Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, in order that those who do not see will see, and those who do not see will become blind. Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and asked him, we aren't blind too, are we? If you were blind, Jesus told them, you wouldn't have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains. There's a lot there. But Jesus ends this story, John ends this recording of this story of this man, this blind man who's been healed. Just his humility. I love it. Like Jesus comes back to him. He finds him. Jesus seeks him out. And he asks the question, who's the Son of Man? I mean, that's a tricky question. In his humility, he's like, I don't know. Just tell me. Like, I'll believe anything you say. Like you have the power of life. Just tell me. Who is he? And I'll believe him. And Jesus says, I'm him. I'm him. And the man falls down and worships Jesus. Now that's shocking for a few reasons. Shocking for one reason is oftentimes there are accounts in the Bible where people are so amazed at other people that they fall down and worship them. In every single one of those accounts where it isn't Jesus, the person goes, get up, stop worshiping. We even see this with angels. When people encounter angels, they fall to their face and they worship the angels, and the angels go, no, that's just for God. Like you get up, you don't worship me, we worship God alone. This man falls down and worships Jesus, and Jesus doesn't go, hey, no, that's inappropriate. Get up, please. This is awkward. Jesus is like, thank you. He allows him to worship him. He is the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says that he came into the world for judgment. Now, this is kind of confusing, especially if you know John 3 or John 12. In the same book, it says Jesus did not come to condemn the world, that Jesus did not come to judge the world. And now it's saying he did come to judge. And there's a lot of debate between New Testament scholars about what exactly is going on here. And here's the best way I think I can explain it. Jesus' primary mission into the world was not to judge the world. It was to save the world. That's what he says in John 3. And yet his very presence amongst people causes decisions. It causes divisions. In a way that when God is present, you don't get to stay neutral. You could be neutral about pretty much everyone you ever meet, right? You meet somebody in the grocery store, you don't have to like choose friend or foe. You're just like, will never see them again, and you just keep moving on. When you meet Jesus and he appears to you, you don't get to just be like, nice to meet you, see you later. He demands a response in and of his own nature. Yet his own nature was not purely to come in and judge and condemn the world, but to save the world. And so the example I always use to help illustrate this is I notice this. I try to eat healthy, but I don't always eat healthy. And I wish I was more like strict about when and where. I just kind of leave it up to the day, right? Some day I'm like, I'm feeling salads today. I'm just going to go hardcore salads. Another time I'm like, triple cheeseburger sounds really good. Let's go for it, right? And there'll be times where I have a lunch meeting and I'm just sitting there standing at the menu and I'm like, what am I going to get? And I go for the burger, like a big burger, French fries. I get it. And then my friend goes, I'll take the kale salad. And it's like, I just feel judged in that moment. They did not come to judge me. That was not why they chose a kale salad. But in that moment, I just ordered a very unhealthy meal, and I just feel uncomfortable. It's just the reality. This is what Jesus' presence does. He is right. And when we're wrong, we just are aware of it. Months ago, I was golfing. I've golfed a few times a year. I used to be good. I'm not good anymore. But my buddy Scotty and I, we were golfing, and we got paired up with two other people. Usually go out in a foursome, and so it was us two and then two strangers. And we're talking. You've got a few hours just to kind of golf and talk. So I'm talking to these two guys and getting to know them a bit, asking tons of questions. What do you do for work, and where are you from, and all that kind of stuff. And they're sharing a ton. They're cussing quite a bit, and they're telling me about all these things they've done in their lives. They're just wild, right? On the 9th hole, our last hole that we're going to be golfing together, the guy, we're talking, and he finally goes, what do you do for a living? And I'm just like, gosh, man, I really hate when this happens, especially after this much time together. And I just said, I'm a pastor of a church in Northridge. And he just looks at me. I was like, are you all right? And he's like, I'm thinking about everything I've said over the last 2.5 hours. And I said that to a pastor. I'm so sorry. And I'm like, it's okay. Like, I did not come to judge the golf course. Like, I'm just here. And yet, me just saying I'm a pastor created that awkwardness of him reevaluating everything that he had said. Jesus infinitely more so than a kale salad or a pastor. When you meet him, he creates in you a decision. You can't stay neutral to him. He says you're either for me or you're against me. And this is what we see over and over and over in the Gospels. And then he talks about the fact that these Pharisees are blind spiritually. So this happens often in the Gospels. Jesus heals people who are physically blind. And then he ties it into the reality of our spiritual blindness, that we don't see clearly when it comes to God. That we don't see very clearly often about our own lives and even our view of suffering. And I think that's what John is unpacking. So I don't want to belittle the fact that Jesus actually healed a man. He did. And we, as a church, love to pray for physical healing. And at the end of the story, though, he doesn't end with, now go out and go pray for physical healing. He ties it back in and goes, you're still in your sins, you Pharisees, because you don't see clearly. And what I think John is trying to get at in this whole story is about this danger of spiritual blindness. The spiritual certainty that many of us walk around with that's actually can cripple us and condemn us. And we see it over and over in this passage, specifically regarding suffering, regarding our view of Jesus, and regarding our view of ourselves. With suffering, we see it in the first couple of verses. Look again at verse 2. After they passed by the man who was born blind, his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus answered. This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. Religious people, and when I say religious people, I am talking about Christians as well, but there's just a tendency with people who believe in God generically that there is oftentimes false certainties about suffering. That when we encounter suffering in our own lives or in the lives of others, we're very quick to go, here's why that's happening. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. Maybe it's just a human nature piece, but when I hear an awful story about somebody, of what someone else is going through, everything in me wants to reason with myself of why that can't happen to me. And you begin to project, well, that happened for these reasons. That they must have done something, or here's the reason they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that's a natural thing that I have to fight against. And this is what we see Jesus' own disciples doing. They see suffering and they go, whose fault is that? And Jesus goes, no, it's not anyone's fault. It's not his or his parents. Back in 2004, many of you will remember, there was a huge earthquake off the west coast of Indonesia that created gigantic tsunami waves, impacting like 7 countries that ended up killing over 225,000 people. That number is so big, we can't even fathom it. 225,000 people dead because of a tsunami. After that had happened, the LA Times ran an article asking religious leaders, why? According to your religion, according to your worldview, how could God allow something this horrific to happen? Which is a phenomenal question. And so they asked a Hindu leader, a Buddhist leader, a Wiccan priest, a Muslim leader, and a Jewish leader, and a Christian leader. Like, what is your response to this horrific natural disaster? The Hindu and Buddhist leader had a pretty similar view of the event due to their understanding of karma. ultimately saying that our fate is our own responsibility due to the things that we've done. Karma is kind of like a sexy idea for many people who don't think deeply about it, but it's really gnarly. Especially when you begin to think about, like when the disciples say, who sinned, him or his parents? Many of us in this room are like, ooh, like you said that out loud? It's the essence of karma. Like there's bad stuff, there's suffering. Whose fault? This is karma. Bad things happen to people who did bad things. The Hindu and Buddhist version of that is they're suffering because you in a past life did something bad, and this is you reaping the consequences of your life. This is why there's a lot of debate, even in India, around what do you do with those who are handicapped and poor and marginalized? Do you help them? If we help them, we might be short-circuiting the karmic circle. Like they need to pay for what they've done, and it's not our job to necessarily get in the way and do justice and help the poor. They asked the Wiccan priestess about this, and she said that this is Mother Nature. She had a kink in her neck, and she was just stretching. And it's narcissistic of us to think that humans are the center of the world, and things like this just happen. The Muslim leader said that this is probably God's way of testing the response of what people will do in afterwards. And the Jewish leader said that God created a finite world, and things like this just happen. And now I'm not going to pretend and say that, I don't want to say they represent their thing perfectly. Hopefully the LA Times did a decent job, searching around for professionals in their field. And yet it was just this taste of going, this is what the different responses to suffering are. And yet what I'd love for you to really think through, what is your response to suffering? Whether it's a tsunami that kills 225,000 people out there for many of us, or your miscarriage, or your divorce, or your physical suffering, the cancer diagnosis, the child born with a disability, getting laid off of your dream job. Like, what do you do with it? How do you handle that? How do you process that? What is your answer? What this text tells us is that if you're a Christian, that the God who created all things, what does he do with suffering? Jesus Christ incarnate, he pushes against the idea that this is not God punishing this man. That's oftentimes our response, isn't it? I get sick. Something happens. It's like, uh-oh, did I do something wrong? Was it last week when I was unkind to my children? Was this? You start doing the formula. You're trying to figure out, is that why I'm in this spot? Or is it something else? I remember at the big January, back when I had COVID, there was one day that was miserable, pounding headache. I just remember laying there going why? This hurts so bad. Can't you God, just touch, pray, say something? It's just gone. And this is the difficulty with Christians, with religious people in general. If you believe in a God who can take away suffering, it's really difficult to figure out why it's still here. He can just put mud on a guy's eyes and take away his blindness. Why don't you do that all the time, Jesus? Why don't you, whether it's very significant or just trivial? And it's easy for us. I talk to a lot of people where it's easy for us even to downplay our own suffering because we always say, at least it's not as bad as blah, 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 right? And there's a reality to that. To some degree, it's good to keep a perspective open. And at the end of the day, it's real because it's our suffering. It's our pain. I'm not that person. I'm me, and this hurts, and this is painful, and it's bad. And yet what Jesus says in verse 3 is fascinating. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. This came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. Now, one of the challenges with a statement like that is we try to figure out, is Jesus talking specifically about this man in particular, or is he talking about all sickness and all suffering and all time and place? I tend to think the first piece, because we also talked a few weeks ago in John 5 when we saw that there was a particular part of suffering that could actually be caused because of something you've done. This is why the Bible is a little bit more complicated than quick, simple answers. Like sometimes when we're suffering, we do need to go, God, is there a reason? And yet Jesus' rebuke to his own disciples is saying, don't run there for other people. That's our tendency. When we see it in other people, we go, oh, it must be something they've done. Jesus goes, don't you dare do that. But Jesus says that you don't have the full picture of suffering. For this specific case, God's works are going to be glorified. God is going to be shown for being powerful and good, and he heals the man. It's real good news. And we sit in this tension of where God sometimes heals and sometimes doesn't. And yet we ask ourselves, okay, God, what do I do with my suffering? Jesus is going to show us as he goes to the cross. I believe that the Christian response to suffering, although it's difficult and it doesn't solve all problems everywhere, I believe that the Christian response to suffering is the greatest. Because we have a God who does not keep himself apart from suffering. We have a God who has entered into the most brutal form of suffering imaginable, him taking on flesh, living a life, dying on a cross. He knows what it's like. And so while I'm constantly, when things are difficult and suffering is real and pain is tangible, the temptation is to go, why God? And yet Jesus is constantly going to draw us back to the cross where he tells us that he loves us, that he's with us and he's for us. And he doesn't answer everything else. Tim Keller, in his phenomenal book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, he says this: we do not know the reason God allows evil and suffering to continue or why it is so random. But now at least we know what the reason is not. It cannot be that he does not love us. It cannot be that he does not care. He is so committed to our ultimate happiness that he was willing to plunge into the greatest depths of suffering himself. He understands us, he has been there, and he assures us that he has a plan to eventually wipe away every tear. Someone might say, but that's only half an answer to the question why. Yes, but it is the half we need. And I love that. There is always going to be a mystery to suffering. Anyone who has a cute, trite little answer to help you in your time of need, you just say, thank you, we're done talking. Why is this happening? Oh, let me tell you why. You are like Job's miserable friends. Job, a righteous man in the Old Testament, a good dude who does righteous acts, encounters the most brutal suffering in the Old Testament we see. And what happens? His friends come to comfort him. And how do they comfort him? Awfully. They're like, they do good for a week. They're quiet and they weep with him. And then after a week, they start to try to diagnose the problem. Hey, Job, have you been sinning lately? Certainly this isn't an accident. You must have some hidden stuff in your life. And then God appears in the last few chapters, and he rebukes Job's friends. He says, you don't know what you're talking about. And fascinatingly enough, God doesn't even explain to Job why he suffered so badly. God just appears to Job and says, it's bigger than you can possibly ever fathom. That's what Keller's saying. He's like, That's only half an answer. He's like, yeah, it is. But it's the half we need to know that he loves us, that he's with us, and he's for us. And so this certainty about suffering, of this is why it happens, we need to loosen our hands on. We need to be able to walk in the pain of even a mystery of going, I don't fully know why. And yet, Jesus tells us, God's at work in the midst of it all. That there are bigger purposes than you and I will ever be able to dream up. Now, do I know exactly what those bigger purposes are of him getting glory from all this? I don't. And I'm not going to try to say, well, it's okay. I've told the story of where this Steve Brown, he's a professor, seminary professor, he told the story where one of his friends passed away. And he met the daughter weeks later, and the daughter came to him in the coffee shop they were at, and he said, I'm so sorry about your father's loss, about your loss of your father. And her response, good Christian answer was, it's okay. Many people came to Christ in the funeral service. And he said, I don't care. And she broke down weeping. Goes, I don't care either. I was able to be honest about the first time. This is the Christians, what we generally do. It's okay, suffering, it's fine because he's going to do it all. It's like, he is. He's good. He's going to work together all things for good. He is. Do I understand what that's exactly going to look like? No, so I don't need to play games. I can weep. I can cry in the midst of the pain and go, I don't get it, but I know that he's good. I know that he loves me, and I know that he's good. He cares for me. So there's a certainty we need to give up. And the last couple things I'll just say briefly. There's a false certainty about Jesus that these religious leaders have. And again, it's easy if you've read the Bible for a while, it's easy for us to kind of go, those Pharisees, they got it all wrong. The reason why Jesus is constantly at work battling with the Pharisees is because they were actually the closest ones to it. The Pharisees weren't like these bad, shady guys. Like they were really trying to do their best to honor Yahweh, to honor God. But they were wrong. They had such certainty that the Messiah, the Christ who came, couldn't be like Jesus. And it is a challenge for all of us to keep our eyes open and our hands open. Do we know Jesus, the true Jesus? Because many of us, we have our versions of Jesus. Like your Jesus is different than her Jesus is, and then just different than his Jesus, different from my Jesus. And we tend to sculpt Jesus into our own image, where we get Jesus on our side, and he justifies everything we do. Anne Lamott says, you know that you've made God in your own image when he hates all the same people you hate. That's what we tend to do. Jesus is just my buddy. He understands me. He understands all of my lifestyle choices. He agrees with everything I do. Everything's fine. I'm certain about it. And yet page after page after page, Jesus, he just demolishes our certainty about what he would look like. This is a challenge for all of us, whether you are not a Christian or you've been walking with Jesus faithfully for years. Like, are you sure you're continually letting the scriptures define who Jesus is? Or are you allowing your own subconscious to kind of infiltrate and be like, oh no, I'm sure Jesus would be fine with this. I've talked to non-Christians who are like, I could never believe in Jesus because of this specific issue. And I get where they're coming from, but I'm like you're so certain that you have God so figured out that you can't be wrong about this one issue. Like that's a bold claim. That you understand the mind of God. I understand it doesn't make sense to you. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense to me. But you understand the mind of God so well that this one area that you don't align with is the very reason why you're going to reject him forever. Can we at least even have some humility in that? Christians as well. What is the blind man certain of? By the end of the story, that he is the Christ, that he's the Messiah, and he worships him. That's something good to be certain about. A lot of the other things that religious people argue about day in and day out are the certainty that we need to loosen our hands on. When I hear Christian conservatives and Christian liberals arguing over politics with certainty, it's just like, hey, maybe relax. Like maybe the Jesus that you see riding a donkey or an elephant is different than the Jesus in the New Testament. Can we have our opinions and our convictions? Yeah, sure, have them. but certainty, we need to grow in humility, because as we'll find in John 17, one of Jesus' deepest desires is for unity. You can't have unity when you're certain about so many secondary issues. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. This is why the church is so divided, because we're certain about so many things that we don't need to be certain about. We can have our convictions. Charismatic, cessationism, complementarianism, egalitarianism, premillennialism, amillennialism. You're like, what are those things? They divide churches. They're theological views. I just spent Tuesday and Wednesday. I'm in seminary right now. My professor, Gary Breshears, he's probably the smartest Bible guy I've ever met in my entire life. He's preaching again here in October. You won't want to miss it. He's been teaching seminary for 40 years. And one of the most beautiful things he models in our class is when someone every once in a while tries to stump him with like just a good question. Sometimes he'll just go, I don't know. And then it's this awkward moment for the person asking. It's like, yeah, okay, cool. Sometimes that person's me. Because even if you've been teaching seminary for 40 years, you still don't know everything. He's a guy who you're like, what's Exodus 14:33? He'll tell you. Like you can play the Bible game with him all day long, and yet he has a humility to go, I don't know. I don't know exactly how everything's going to turn out in the end times. But you talk to some people and they got a chart. They'll show you exactly the day Jesus is returning. Jesus said he didn't even know when he was returning. But this guy on TV knows. It's like, let's relax. And I'm not talking about a certainty like post-truth, postmodern. We don't know anything. I'm not talking about that. I've played those games in college. I had a professor who was very post-truth, made the claim one day in class that there is no such thing as truth. And I asked, is that a truth? He said, let me get back to you. And the next day in class, he said, that is the only truth, that there is no truth. It's like, okay, cool. And then we took a quiz that day in class. And I raised my hand before the quiz started. I said, I just want to make sure before we take this quiz that there are no right answers. He said, be quiet, Brad, take your quiz. I'm not talking about that. There is truth. There is objective truth. There are things we should be certain about, namely Jesus Christ himself. But there's this spiritual blindness. There's this blindness of even our own selves that we need to be very careful about. See, the thing about physical blindness is you know you're physically blind. But with spiritual blindness, you don't even know you're spiritually blind. This is what sin does to all of us. It blinds us to who we actually are. And this is why we are utterly dependent upon Jesus and his church to show us our true selves. We need him to push against us, to open our eyes and open our hearts about areas we're wrong on. And we need community to do that all the more. Brothers and sisters who love us enough to go, hey, do you see this in your life? These religious leaders, they were certain about so many things and they were so wrong. And as a church, we want to be a people who are humble enough that when a brother or sister comes to us lovingly and encourages us, challenges us, shows us something, that our first reaction isn't, you're wrong. Trust me, I'm right about everything. Of course, we wouldn't say that, but that's how we act in our defensive posture. Charles Spurgeon, one of my favorite quotes, he says, don't get angry when someone thinks poorly of you, because you're far worse than they could ever know. That's the reality of spiritual blindness. You might think something about me, and it might be wrong. But if you knew everything about me, you'd have a worse opinion. And the same thing's true of you. And so when someone comes to you and challenges you on something, your defensive posture of, no, I see everything clearly. We get to lay that down at the foot of the cross. The cross of Jesus Christ has proven forever, you're wrong. You're sinful, you're broken beyond you could possibly ever imagine and repair yourself. No self-help book is ever going to make you well. In his grace and in his love, he said, but I've come to save you. I love you and I want to make you new. Will you trust me and allow me to become the king over every single area of your life? Let's pray. Before we pray, would you mind, I know some of you are going through really, really hard things. Like life's just hard. Suffering or job or finances or relationships, whatever it is. If you find yourself just in a really hard season right now, like life's just hard, I'd love just to pray for you. We're not going to ask you what it is, but would you mind just standing up? And I'd just love to pray over you. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for these men and women. So many of whom I know and the challenges they're facing. Others I don't. But you do. Pray against the lie that they are either believing or they've heard said against them. It must be because they're doing something wrong. It's because of this thing that happened back then. Jesus, would you comfort their hearts? Would they know that you are near? Would they know that you love them? Would they know that you defend them? That they do not stand alone? That you are an empathetic high priest who weeps when your people weep? You're the compassionate King who looks at the crowds and just sees how deeply they need you. And you heal and you teach and you meet with them. Jesus, would you heal the men and women in this room? This physical pain is unbearable. For those who have children or loved ones whose life is just really, really difficult, Lord, would you heal? Would you give them strength? For those who are going through relational difficulty that feels like it's killing their soul, Jesus, would you heal? Would you comfort them? Those who have financial problems beyond their wildest belief, God, would you meet with them? Would you provide? Jesus, thank you for the cross. Thank you for the promise that one day you will wipe away every one of our tears. We long for that day to be with you face to face. Meantime, would you give us courage? Would you give us strength to endure and persevere through the difficulty that life can just be so difficult? Thank you that you're the God who came to be with us. You're not absent and apathetic. You're the only one who understands every single thing these people that are standing are experiencing. You're the only one. All of us can say, I know, I can imagine, I can understand how hard it is, but you're the only one who gets it to the degree that they need it. Would they feel that today? I love you. It's in your beautiful name. Amen.